Hello, my name's Steve Rhodes and I'm a local videographer doing little videos about exciting little local events. I'm presently working on one about how this bird has become the much loved symbol for the people of Woolloongabba, and you'll be seeing it soon on YouTube. Anyway, the other day my old friend and colleague Rick Adams sent me this invitation to attend a radical walking tour of the Troublemaker's history of South Brisbane Cemetery. I thought this could be a golden opportunity to make a movie about the walk, and I might pick up some more shots of scrub turkeys. So Rick and I decided to go on a reconnaissance mission on the day before the walk to soak up the atmosphere of the place, with my daughter Penny operating the video camera. We were greeted by Mina Rowe, whose family had established the now famous Rose Arcade in Brisbane in 1926. Well before Nina had taken up permanent residency here in 1950. The combination of the beautiful old trees and the old tombstones make the place a visual feast. Some of them are tributes to the skill of the stonemasons of yesteryear, and even though many had been ravaged by time, tree roots and neglect, they were the most interesting of them all.
Today the tour is going to visit 9 different graves throughout the cemetery, and before I start I just want to acknowledge the very great support that we've got from the Friends of South Brisbane Cemetery, who have already done a lot of the research that I've relied on to bring this tour together. We've managed to help fill in some gaps, but a lot of it was provided by them. This is very much a tour where we'll be talking about ordinary people who are involved in extraordinary events. But this is a good landmark to start on. Robert King is famous for having, famous among some people, for having been the member for Maranoa, the Labour member for Maranoa from 1893 to 1899. He was one of 12 Labour members elected in the wake of the shearers' strike in 1893. What I think the lesson we can learn from Robert and his story is the lesson of sectarianism being used to divide the working class. Now, sectarianism for the younger people was a very prominent theme in Australian politics right up until really the 1970s. There were still traces of it. So our second grave, to me, is symbolic in a lot of ways of the contribution of women to the labour movement in the 19th and 20th century, unfortunately not properly marked. Now, with Maggie's grave, it did used to have a headstone, I'm informed, but it's been damaged over the years, you might see from a tree that grew up through it. But for me, people like Maggie should have like monuments in King George Square almost, rather than some of the other people who do, because this is her obituary from the Daily Standard. She died in 1915. She was someone who actively supported the Great Strike of 1912. Maggie Finney died last Thursday after being ill for about 3 weeks, was a sterling and self-sacrificing worker in the labour cause, both industrial and political, for a great part of her young life. Oh, by the way, she died when she was 28.
I live locally, so I know this cemetery reasonably well, but I hadn't known a lot of the people that were on the tour this afternoon. I guess I particularly enjoyed the way that women were included. It's a bit sad that most of the women weren't properly marked or recognised, but it's great that this tour picks them up and acknowledges them and recognises them.
Okay, so our next grave is Captain Dan O'Carroll, who died on Christmas morning in 1924 in a consumptive home in Brisbane. He was only 31, as you can see, when he passed away, but he had a very eventful life. Has anyone ever seen the movie Michael Collins? Yeah. Well, the scene in that is basically this guy was involved in, which is essentially there was a group of British intelligence officers called the Cairo Gang, and basically they had been sent to Dublin to hunt out the leadership of the IRA and basically execute them. Well, Collins organised a counter squad basically that before the British could get them, they got the British, and one interesting story that I find about him is that he actually visited Paddy Moran in Mountjoy prison 3 times under the nose of the British without being detected, including one. I can't connect the events, I have no, but just after he visited him once, Paddy and another successfully escaped, but Paddy refused to leave the prison grounds because he said that to do so would be an admission of guilt, that he was running away from something that he claimed he hadn't done.
It's fantastic to hear all the radical history that we just don't know about or get taught, especially when it's so local.
Likewise, it was a really informative tour. I think the guide definitely had a lot of his information together, and it was really informative to see how far labour movements have come since, the 1800s all the way through to today.
I found the tour extremely informative. The depth of knowledge about local history and from other parts of the world, how it's all come together in Mianjin to form the basis of what we have today, was really interesting to learn about.
The strike was broken. I'll see if I can out-yell him.
Imagine they're Carlton supporters.
Yeah. Okay, now, for those of you, it's a bit hard to read, but this is a copy of this headstone that we're looking at here, and I'll just read it out. It says, our dear brother and anti-fascist comrade Eduardo Manacero, born 1900, died 6th of October 1944. Now, when I first came out here to look at doing this tour, it was actually Chris who showed me this grave. They didn't really know much about him, and that's one thing that I'm pleased that I was able to do in organising this tour is I found this is a copy of Eduardo's internment record during World War II that was in the National Archive down in Canberra, and from that I've been able to piece together a lot of his story.
It was interesting, but I'm more into the social history rather than the political history. But it gives me a starting point for doing my own research.
Hugo Kunz, he was a master painter and he was a socialist activist from Germany. He was from Dresden, and he came to Australia after having been active in the German Social Democratic Party, which was banned and persecuted when Bismarck introduced anti-socialist laws in 1878 and 1880. Now he settled in South Brisbane and was one of a group that formed what was called the Social Democratic Vanguard with Ernst Lane, the brother of William Lane, who formed that colony in Paraguay, and presented itself as a socialist propaganda organisation. And his main work, and the main work of the group, was publishing socialist tracts and leaflets and getting them published in the Labour press and sent around. He was, according to the group's history, the SDV's most tireless organiser and of propaganda, sending thousands of tracts all over Queensland in an effort to do what he said was to paint the state red. And they did have enough people to distribute over 60,000 leaflets around Queensland. Apparently Otto used to have a map of Queensland on his board at home, and he would colour in red when he'd sent leaflets there.
It was very informative and up to the usual standard of Brisbane Labour.
This last burial, it isn't of someone who was connected that I know in any way with the Labour movement during their lifetime, but her death is certainly significant and a reminder of why it's important that we have a Labour movement and that we need to continue to, that the fight for progress is never really won. You have to keep struggling. And this is Mary Emmett. So that's a picture of her that was in the Courier Mail after her death. Now, the reason I've included her is just in the last few months we've had Roe versus Wade overturned in the United States. Well, Mary, the story of her death is why we're here, is that early on the morning of Good Friday in 1938, a bottle collector found Mary's body in the rockery next to Brisbane Girls Grammar School on Gregory Terrace, and the investigations of the police soon came to the conclusion that her body had been placed in the rockery after her death, and that she'd been carrying a considerable amount of money. And their belief following an autopsy and after interviewing her family was that she'd sought an abortion, which was illegal in Queensland at that time, and she died as a result of the illegal procedure. By the way, the lead officer in the police investigation into Mary's death was anyone who grew up in Queensland in the 1950s and 60s, which is some people here, might remember the name of Frank Bischoff, who was the corrupt police commissioner, who was so corrupt that, he was in the pay of basically every gambling den, brothel and illegal abortionist, by the time he was. So, I don't know, again, speculation, but I doubt he was very thorough in his investigation. The short story is that the doctor who performed the abortion and dumped her body like she was garbage was never charged with anything and got off scot-free, and it was 80 years after her death before abortion became legal in Queensland. And even then, it's legal in Queensland, but there's a difference between legal and accessible, and I think there's still a lot to be done on that front in Queensland. So I know it's a bit of a downer to finish on, but I just think it's important for us to go away and realise that it's not just about remembering some glorious past and having nice stories, it's about using that past to build for the future and build a better world for the future. So thank you everyone, let's see you. As well, just to re-emphasise, we're not taking any money in donations or anything, but if anyone feels they would like to give a donation, and anyone who wants a tea or a coffee, the Friends of South Brisbane Cemetery are back down there.
He's such a wonderful speaker, and it was so fascinating to learn about all these interesting people that were in Brisbane. We knew nothing of these wonderful characters who made up Brisbane, did we?
I thought it was an absolutely fantastic way to learn about Labour history. Beautiful sunny day, really interesting material. Let's have more of them.
I agree entirely. It was a great day out. I was a bit disappointed though we didn't see any scrub turkeys, but never mind, those kookaburras back there, they certainly made up for it. And I was very interested when we stopped at the plaque that the Brisbane City Council had placed in the cemetery in remembrance of those poor souls who'd been hanged at Boggo Road. It was right next to the grave of one of Queensland's most notorious bushrangers, which one of my friends in our cemetery walking group had told me about. It was such an interesting story that I decided to make a little movie about it. And here it is. One morning I made an interesting discovery while I was studying this plaque that had been planted here by the Brisbane City Council. It was in memory of the 41 men and one woman who'd been buried here back in the good old days between 1883 to 1922. They came from all over the world just to end their lives dangling from a hangman's noose just down the road at the old Boggo Road Jail. They were then transported back up the road to the Dutton Park Cemetery and buried in an unmarked grave in unconsecrated ground. If you were a criminal who died at the end of a noose, you were totally undeserving of a headstone and were simply dumped into a hole in the ground, covered up and forgotten. But there was one man who managed to buck the system. Martin, a fellow dog enthusiast and cemetery historian, introduced him to me. Where's that bushranger's grave you were talking about?
Right there. Oh, it's all covered in crap. How's that?
Patrick Knief was a bushranger and cattle rustler. He and his brother James terrorised the citizens of Roma and the Upper Warrego areas until they were apprehended by the police after a shootout in which 2 policemen were killed. Consequently, Patrick was sentenced to be hanged on the 12th of January 1903, but his brother James had his sentence reduced to life imprisonment with hard labour. Somehow, the Knief family were given permission to stage a lavish funeral for Patrick, even though the burial would still occur in unconsecrated ground. The whole enthralling saga can be seen on YouTube. Patrick's coffin was made from polished cedar with silver mountings and embellished with religious symbols. A funeral procession made up of over 30 vehicles, accompanied by 400 people on foot, made its way to the cemetery where Patrick was laid to rest with a full Roman Catholic burial service. After Patrick's execution, it was reported that the cost of the government for the capture and the trial of the Kniefs was £3,601, 2 shillings and 10 pence. But his family had to foot the bill for the funeral.